England during the Second World War. When the summer of 1939 began, England was home to a population of roughly 41 million people. London alone contained more than 8 million inhabitants and was by far the largest city in the country. Birmingham, Liverpool, Manchester, Sheffield, Bristol and Leeds formed the industrial heart of England, while thousands of smaller towns and villages were connected by one of the most extensive railway systems in the world. For many people, daily life still followed patterns that had changed very little over the previous decades. Milk was delivered to homes in glass bottles during the early morning hours. Coal was brought by delivery men and stored beside houses for use during the colder months. Bread was often purchased fresh each day, and many families visited local butchers, bakers, and greengrocers several times a week rather than making large purchases all at once. Radio had become an important part of everyday life. By 1939, millions of homes owned wireless sets, and families often gathered in the evening to listen to news broadcasts, music programs, and comedy shows. The British Broadcasting Corporation, better known simply as the BBC, had become one of the country's most trusted institutions. During the years ahead, its importance would grow even further. Cars remained expensive and were still beyond the reach of many ordinary families. Public transport carried much of the country to work every day. London buses travelled familiar routes through the capital, while trains connected cities, towns, and villages across the country. Railway stations were busy places from early morning until late evening, and the sound of steam locomotives was part of everyday life for millions of people. Although memories of the First World War were still strong, many people hoped that Europe would avoid another major conflict. Nearly every town in England contained men who had fought in France between 1914 and 1918. Many families still remembered fathers, brothers, and sons who had never returned home. The war memorials standing in village squares and outside churches served as constant reminders of those losses. During the 1930s, however, events on the European continent increasingly worried British politicians and military planners. The growth of German military power attracted particular attention. Newspapers frequently carried stories about developments in Europe, and international politics became a common topic of conversation in homes and workplaces throughout England. The British government gradually began making preparations for the possibility of war. Air raid precautions, often shortened to ARP, became an important national program. Local authorities organized volunteers, distributed information, and prepared emergency plans for air attacks against British cities. Many experts believed that if war came, bombing raids against civilian populations would begin almost immediately. Some predictions suggested that hundreds of thousands of people could be killed during the first few weeks of fighting. These estimates would later prove to be exaggerated, but in 1939 they were taken very seriously. One of the largest preparations involved the production and distribution of gas masks. Memories of poison gas attacks during the First World War remain vivid, and the government feared that chemical weapons might once again be used against civilian populations. Millions of gas masks were manufactured and prepared for distribution. Adults received larger masks, while special versions were designed for children and babies. Infants who were too young to wear masks were provided with protective carriers that surrounded them completely and allowed air to be pumped inside by hand. During the final days of peace, large numbers of these gas masks were distributed to the public. Before long, carrying a gas mask would become as common as carrying a bag or briefcase. School children often took them to class each day, and adults frequently brought them to work. As August 1939 drew to a close, newspapers increasingly focused on developments involving Poland and Germany. International negotiations continued, but optimism slowly faded. On the morning of the 1st of September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Throughout England, people followed developments closely through newspaper reports and radio broadcasts. Although Britain was not yet at war, many suspected that events were moving rapidly toward conflict. 2 days later, on the 3rd of September, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain addressed the nation by radio. His announcement was brief and direct. Britain was now at war with Germany. For many listeners, the moment remained unforgettable for the rest of their lives. Families stood silently around wireless sets as Chamberlain spoke. Some later remembered hearing church bells in the distance after the broadcast ended. Others remembered neighbors stepping outside their homes to discuss the news with one another. Despite the importance of the announcement, daily life did not immediately transform overnight. Trains continued to run. Factories opened as usual. Shops remained open. Children played in streets and parks. The weather itself gave no indication that Europe had entered another war. Yet changes began appearing almost immediately. Within hours, air raid sirens sounded in several cities. Many people hurried toward shelters or underground stations, expecting bombing raids to begin at any moment. Nothing happened. The skies remained empty. The feared attacks did not arrive. The first weeks of the war therefore created an unusual atmosphere throughout the country. Britain was officially at war, yet for most civilians there was little visible evidence of it. This period eventually became known as the Phony War. The government nevertheless continued preparations at great speed. Perhaps the largest movement of civilians in British history took place during these first days of the conflict. The authorities had long feared that major cities would become targets for bombing, and plans had already been developed to move children away from urban areas. On the 1st of September, even before Britain had formally entered the war, evacuation began. Children gathered at schools carrying small suitcases, labels attached to their coats and gas masks hanging from straps around their shoulders. Teachers organized groups and checked lists repeatedly. Parents accompanied children to assembly points and railway stations. Many families had little idea where their children would be sent or how long they would remain away from home. Some children viewed the experience as an adventure. Others were frightened and confused. Thousands of trains carried children from London, Birmingham, Liverpool and other major cities toward smaller towns and villages in the countryside. By the end of the first few days, more than 1 million people had been evacuated, including children, teachers, mothers with infants and individuals with disabilities. Many rural communities suddenly found themselves welcoming large numbers of newcomers. Village schools became more crowded. Families opened spare bedrooms. Farmhouses that had once housed only a few people suddenly became homes for many more. The evacuation revealed differences between urban and rural Britain that many people had never previously encountered. Some city children saw farm animals for the first time in their lives. Some country families were surprised by the experiences and backgrounds of children arriving from industrial cities. The adjustment was not always easy, but many friendships formed during these years would last for decades. At the same time, another change spread rapidly across England. The blackout began. Street lights were turned off. Shop signs were extinguished. Windows had to be covered after dark so that no light could be seen from outside. Heavy curtains, wooden boards, and dark fabric appeared in homes throughout the country. Even a small amount of visible light could lead to complaints from neighbors or visits from local wardens. Driving became considerably more difficult. Car headlights were partially covered to reduce visibility from the air. Cyclists often found themselves traveling through almost complete darkness. Pedestrians carried torches and moved carefully along streets that had once been brightly illuminated. The blackout would remain a part of British life for almost 6 years. For an entire generation, darkness became one of the defining memories of wartime evenings. As autumn turned toward winter in 1939, England settled into the strange reality of a nation at war that had not yet experienced major combat on its own soil. Factories increased production. Young men joined the armed forces. Air raid shelters were constructed in gardens and public spaces. Families listened carefully to the evening news. And across the country, millions of people waited to discover what the coming months would bring. The phony war. The first months of the war were unlike anything many people had expected. During September and October of 1939, there was no immediate invasion of Britain, no bombing campaign against London, and no large military battles involving British forces in Western Europe. Newspapers continued to report dramatic events taking place elsewhere, but for many civilians in England, everyday life remained surprisingly familiar. This period became known as the Phony War. The term reflected the strange feeling that Britain was officially at war, while daily routines continued with relatively few interruptions. Factories continued operating. Shops remained open. Football matches were still discussed in pubs and workplaces. Trains continued to arrive and depart according to their schedules. At the same time, however, signs of war could be seen almost everywhere. New military camps appeared across the countryside. Convoys of army vehicles occasionally passed through villages and market towns. Young men in uniform became a common sight at railway stations and in city centers. The government moved quickly to increase military production. Britain had entered the war with armed forces that were smaller than those of several European powers, and there was widespread recognition that production would need to increase dramatically. Aircraft factories expanded their operations. New workers were hired. Additional shifts were introduced. Many factories began operating around the clock. The aircraft industry received particular attention. During the years that followed, England would become one of the largest producers of military aircraft in the world. Factories in places such as Southampton, Coventry, and Birmingham produced thousands of fighters and bombers that would eventually serve across Europe, North Africa, and Asia. The government also introduced rationing plans, although food shortages had not yet become severe. Officials remembered the experience of the First World War, when German submarines had threatened Britain's supply lines. As an island nation that depended heavily on imported food, Britain remained vulnerable to disruption at sea. In January 1940, rationing officially began with bacon, butter, and sugar. Other items followed gradually over the following years. Each person received a ration book containing coupons that allowed them to purchase certain quantities of controlled goods. The exact amounts changed regularly depending on supplies and shipping losses. For many families, the ration book became one of the most important possessions in the household. Shopping itself changed considerably. Having money was no longer enough to purchase goods. A person needed both money and the correct coupons. Families learned to plan meals carefully and avoid waste whenever possible. The Ministry of Food encouraged citizens to become creative with ingredients and introduced recipes designed to make the most of limited supplies. Many of these wartime recipes remained famous long after the war had ended. The government also encouraged people to grow their own food. Gardens, parks, and unused land were converted into vegetable plots as part of the Dig for Victory campaign. Potatoes, carrots, onions, and cabbages became particularly important crops. Even public spaces sometimes found new uses. Lawns that had once existed purely for decoration were occasionally transformed into productive farmland. Throughout the winter of 1939 and 1940, military training intensified. Thousands of men volunteered for military service. Others were called up under conscription laws that had already been introduced before the outbreak of war. Training camps operated across England. New recruits learned how to march, maintain equipment, and operate weapons. Many soldiers spent long periods waiting, training, and preparing without knowing when they might eventually see combat. The Royal Navy immediately began one of the largest tasks of the war. Britain depended heavily on imported food, oil, and raw materials arriving by sea from North America and from throughout the British Empire. Protecting these shipping routes became essential. Merchant ships traveled in convoys escorted by warships in an effort to reduce losses from German submarines operating in the Atlantic Ocean. For sailors serving aboard these ships, the war had already become very real. Conditions in the North Atlantic were often harsh even without enemy action. Storms, freezing temperatures and enormous waves made voyages dangerous throughout the year. German submarines added another threat to already difficult conditions. The Battle of the Atlantic would continue for almost the entire duration of the war and would eventually become one of Britain's most important struggles. Back in England, preparations for air raids continued. Air raid shelters became increasingly common sights. Many families installed small prefabricated shelters in their gardens. These structures became known as Anderson shelters, named after Sir John Anderson, the government minister responsible for air raid precautions. The shelters were made from corrugated steel panels that were assembled partially below ground level and then covered with soil. Many families attempted to make them more comfortable by adding blankets, chairs, and small shelves. Some even decorated the interiors with pictures and curtains. For people who lacked gardens, public shelters were constructed by local authorities. Large buildings were reinforced and prepared for emergency use. The London Underground would eventually become one of the most famous examples, although at this stage the government initially discouraged its use as sleeping accommodation. Air raid precaution wardens became familiar figures in neighbourhoods across England. Their responsibilities included enforcing blackout regulations, directing civilians during emergencies and providing information during air raids. Many were volunteers. They carried whistles, flashlights and notebooks and often spent long hours patrolling streets after dark. The work could be exhausting, particularly during cold winter nights. Nevertheless, thousands volunteered for the role. By early 1940, England had become a country waiting for events that had not yet arrived. The blackout had become routine. Gas masks had become ordinary objects. Military uniforms had become familiar sights. Yet the feared bombing raid still had not begun. Many children who had been evacuated during the autumn slowly began returning home because parents believed the danger had passed. Some historians later estimated that nearly half of the evacuated children eventually returned to the cities during this period. This decision would later prove unfortunate for many families. On the continent, however, events were beginning to move again. In April 1940, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway. For Britain, the campaign carried particular importance because control of Norwegian ports and shipping routes affected the transport of iron ore from Sweden to Germany. British forces became involved in the fighting in Norway, but the campaign ended unsuccessfully. The political consequences in London were significant. Criticism of the government's handling of the operation grew rapidly. Confidence in Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain weakened. The events in Norway marked the beginning of a political crisis that would soon transform British leadership during one of the most dangerous periods in the country's history. Far more serious developments followed only weeks later. On the 10th of May, 1940, Germany launched a major offensive in Western Europe. German forces attacked Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. The long period of waiting was over. The war was about to move much closer to England itself. The crisis of 1940. The 10th of May, 1940 marked one of the most important days of the war for Britain. During the early hours of the morning, German forces began their offensive against Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. The attack quickly expanded into France, and within days it became clear that the conflict in Western Europe was developing far more rapidly than many military planners had expected. On the very same day, political change arrived in London. Neville Chamberlain resigned as Prime Minister after growing criticism of his government's handling of the war, particularly following the campaign in Norway. He was replaced by Winston Churchill, who formed a new coalition government that included members from several political parties. Churchill was already a well-known figure in British politics. He had served in numerous government positions over previous decades and had spent years warning about the danger posed by German rearmament during the 1930s. Many members of the public heard his voice on the radio for the first time as Prime Minister during those uncertain days of May 1940. His speeches would eventually become some of the most famous broadcasts in British history. At the same time, events in France continued to deteriorate. German armoured divisions advanced with extraordinary speed through the Ardennes region and reached the English Channel far earlier than Allied commanders had expected. Large British and French forces suddenly found themselves trapped in northern France. The British Expeditionary Force, often referred to simply as the BEF, faced the possibility of destruction or capture. For Britain, the consequences would have been enormous. The British Army had sent much of its professional force to France. If these troops were lost, defending the British Isles against a possible invasion would become vastly more difficult. Attention quickly turned toward the French port of Dunkirk. Between the 26th of May and the 4th of June, 1940, one of the most famous evacuations in military history took place. The operation received the code name Operation Dynamo. The goal was simple in theory but extraordinarily difficult in practice. As many troops as possible were to be evacuated across the English Channel and returned to Britain. The beaches around Dunkirk soon became crowded with soldiers waiting for transport. Many stood in long lines stretching into shallow water. Others waited among sand dunes or improvised defensive positions while German forces continued advancing toward the area. The evacuation relied on every available vessel. Royal Navy destroyers carried large numbers of troops, but smaller civilian vessels also played an important role. Fishing boats, pleasure craft, river launches and privately owned yachts crossed the channel to assist in the operation. The image of the little ships of Dunkirk quickly became part of British national memory. In total, more than 338,000 Allied soldiers were evacuated. Approximately 198,000 of these were British troops. Large quantities of equipment had to be abandoned in France. Thousands of vehicles, artillery pieces, and weapons were left behind. However, the soldiers themselves had been saved. For many people in England, relief mixed with uncertainty. The evacuation had succeeded beyond expectations, yet the military situation remained extremely serious. France continued fighting for only a few more weeks. Paris fell on the 14th of June. The French government eventually requested an armistice, which came into effect on the 25th of June, 1940. Britain now stood alone against Germany. The possibility of invasion suddenly appeared very real. Throughout southern England, preparations accelerated. Road signs were removed in many areas to make navigation more difficult for invading forces. Defensive positions were strengthened. Concrete obstacles appeared along beaches and roads. Trenches were dug in fields and parks. Barbed wire became a common sight along sections of coastline considered vulnerable to landings. The Home Guard was established during this period. Originally known as the Local Defense Volunteers, the organization attracted enormous numbers of recruits. Many members were older men who were too old for regular military service. Others worked in industries considered essential to the war effort and therefore remained in civilian occupations. Within a short period, hundreds of thousands of men had volunteered. Training varied considerably during the early months. Weapons were often in short supply. Some units trained with wooden rifles or improvised equipment while waiting for proper supplies to arrive. Despite these difficulties, the Home Guard became an important part of Britain's defensive preparations. Their duties included guarding important locations, observing suspicious activity and assisting local authorities during emergencies. Meanwhile, military construction expanded rapidly. Pillboxes appeared across the countryside. These small defensive bunkers were usually built from reinforced concrete and positioned to protect roads, bridges, and potential invasion routes. Thousands were constructed throughout England. Many remained standing for decades after the war and can still be found today in fields and beside rivers. The Royal Air Force also prepared for the possibility of invasion. Airfields throughout southern England became centres of intense activity. Aircraft were repaired, refueled and dispersed to reduce their vulnerability to attack. Pilots trained continuously. Ground crews worked long hours to keep aircraft operational. Radar stations along the coast became increasingly important. Britain had invested heavily in radar technology before the war. A chain of radar installations stretched along much of the eastern and southern coastline. These stations provided early warning of approaching aircraft and would soon prove invaluable. For ordinary civilians, the summer of 1940 brought a mixture of anxiety and determination. People listened carefully to news bulletins. Newspaper headlines often focused on military developments. Rumors spread quickly and were discussed in workplaces, shops, and queues. Many families prepared emergency supplies. Some wondered whether fighting might soon reach British streets and towns. At the same time, daily life continued. Factories remained busy. Schools remained open. Trains continued to operate. Milk was still delivered every morning. Postal workers still completed their rounds. The ordinary routines of life continued beside preparations for extraordinary events. By July 1940, attention increasingly turned toward the skies above southern England. German planners understood that an invasion across the English Channel would be extremely difficult if the Royal Air Force remained strong. Before any landing could be attempted, control of the air would have to be achieved. The next stage of the war would therefore be fought not on beaches or in fields, but high above them. The Battle of Britain was about to begin. The Battle of Britain. The Battle of Britain began during the summer of 1940 and continued into the autumn. It became the first major military campaign fought almost entirely in the air, and it would become one of the defining moments of the war for England. German planners understood that an invasion of Britain would require control of the skies above the English Channel and southern England. As long as the Royal Air Force remained capable of defending British airspace, any large-scale landing operation would involve enormous risks. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, therefore began a campaign intended to destroy fighter command and gain air superiority. The first phase of the battle focused heavily on shipping in the English Channel. Merchant vessels and coastal convoys became frequent targets. Ports and harbour facilities also came under attack. Gradually, attention shifted toward airfields, aircraft factories, and radar stations. The Royal Air Force entered the battle with two aircraft that would become famous throughout the world. The first was the Hawker Hurricane. The second was the Supermarine Spitfire. The Spitfire would eventually become one of the most recognizable aircraft of the entire war, but during the Battle of Britain the Hurricane actually accounted for a larger proportion of enemy aircraft destroyed. The two fighters complemented each other well. The Spitfire generally engaged German fighter aircraft, while the Hurricane often concentrated on bombers. Pilots came not only from Britain but from across the Commonwealth and occupied Europe. Men from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and several other countries flew alongside British pilots. Polish squadrons in particular earned an impressive reputation during the fighting. Many of their pilots had already experienced combat during the German invasion of Poland the previous year. One of Britain's greatest advantages was its radar network. Before the war, a chain of radar stations had been constructed along much of the coastline. These installations were capable of detecting incoming aircraft long before they reached their targets. Information from radar stations was combined with reports from thousands of civilian observers stationed throughout the country. The result was a remarkably effective warning system. Rather than keeping aircraft constantly in the air searching for enemy formations, Fighter Command could direct squadrons toward specific threats as they developed. This saved fuel, reduced pilot fatigue and made more efficient use of limited resources. The system was organized under the leadership of Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding. His command structure allowed information to move rapidly from radar stations to operations rooms and then to individual squadrons. Large maps displayed aircraft movements across southern England, and teams of operators updated positions continuously using markers and colored counters. Many of those working in these operations rooms were members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. Their work rarely attracted headlines, but it played a vital role in the defense of the country. For fighter pilots, daily life became exhausting. Many flew several sorties in a single day. A pilot might finish one engagement, land to refuel and rearm, and then receive orders to take off again within minutes. Meals were often interrupted by alarms. Sleep became irregular. The summer of 1940 was unusually warm, and cockpits could become extremely uncomfortable during long periods of waiting on the ground. Pilots spent much of their time sitting beside their aircraft in readiness huts, waiting for telephones to ring. The scramble order could arrive at any moment. When it did, pilots ran toward their aircraft as ground crews removed wheel chocks and started engines. Within minutes, squadrons could be climbing into the sky. Ground crews worked equally hard. After each mission, aircraft needed to be refueled, rearmed and inspected for damage. Bullet holes were patched. Engines were checked. Tires were replaced. During busy periods, crews sometimes worked throughout the night to ensure aircraft would be ready for the following morning. Aircraft production became one of Britain's highest priorities. Factories across England increased output dramatically. Women entered the workforce in growing numbers and became essential to industrial production. By the later years of the war, women would perform an enormous range of jobs that had previously been dominated by men. In aircraft factories they assembled engines, installed equipment and inspected finished machines before delivery. The Luftwaffe initially concentrated much of its effort against airfields and radar facilities. Some stations suffered considerable damage. Several fighter airfields in southern England experienced repeated attacks. Losses on both sides mounted steadily. Aircraft production therefore became a race against attrition. New aircraft and trained pilots needed to replace those that had been lost. Throughout August 1940, the intensity of the fighting increased. Some days involved hundreds of aircraft. Large formations crossed the Channel and headed toward targets in southern England. Contrails and engine noise became familiar sights and sounds in many communities. People working in fields occasionally stopped to watch distant aircraft maneuvering high overhead. Children sometimes collected fragments of aircraft that had crashed nearby. By late August and early September, Fighter Command was under severe pressure. Several airfields had suffered repeated attacks. Pilots were exhausted. Replacement crews often arrived with limited experience. The situation was serious enough that some commanders worried about how long current losses could be sustained. Then an important change occurred. German attacks increasingly shifted away from airfields and toward cities. London became the principal target. This decision provided Fighter Command with valuable time to recover and repair damaged facilities. The reasons for the shift remain debated by historians, but its consequences proved significant. The Battle of Britain gradually evolved into a wider bombing campaign against urban areas. For civilians, the nature of the war was about to change dramatically. The first large raid against London took place on the 7th of September, 1940. Hundreds of bombers crossed the coast and headed toward the capital. Docklands in East London suffered particularly severe damage. Fires burned throughout the night. For many people, this marked the true beginning of the war at home. The period that followed would become known simply as the Blitz. For months, air raid sirens, searchlights and anti-aircraft guns would become part of everyday life throughout much of England. The war that had once seemed distant was now arriving directly above the streets and rooftops of British cities. The Blitz. When people in England spoke about the Blitz, they were referring to the long period of bombing that began in September 1940 and continued through much of the following year. The name came from the German word Blitzkrieg, meaning lightning war, although the experience itself rarely felt fast to those who lived through it. For many civilians, the Blitz was defined not by moments of action, but by long hours of waiting. Waiting for the sirens. Waiting inside shelters. Waiting for the sound of aircraft to fade into the distance. Waiting to discover what the morning would reveal. The first major raid against London took place on the evening of the 7th of September, 1940. More than 300 German bombers, escorted by hundreds of fighters, crossed the English Channel and approached the city. The docks in East London were among the first targets. Warehouses, storage facilities, and industrial buildings burned throughout the night. The fires could be seen from many miles away. Over the months that followed, London would experience bombing on 57 consecutive nights. The attacks varied in size and intensity, but the possibility of air raids became part of daily life. The air raid siren quickly became one of the defining sounds of wartime Britain. Its rising and falling tone could be heard at any hour of the day or night. Conversation stopped. Factory machines were switched off. Children gathered their belongings. Families moved toward shelters. The all-clear signal often came many hours later. For millions of people, sleep became fragmented and unpredictable. Some families preferred to remain inside their homes. Others spent every night in shelters. The Anderson shelter became one of the most familiar sights in suburban gardens. Constructed from corrugated steel and partially buried underground, it provided protection against blast and flying debris. Conditions inside could be uncomfortable. During winter months they were cold and damp. Condensation formed on the metal walls. Blankets, cushions, and hot water bottles became important possessions. Some families attempted to improve conditions by adding shelves, rugs, and small lamps. Others planted flowers above the shelters, partly to improve their appearance and partly because space was limited and every part of a garden had to serve a purpose. In urban areas, many people relied on communal shelters. Schools, public buildings, and specially constructed facilities provided protection for large numbers of civilians. Perhaps the most famous shelters were found within the London Underground system. At first, authorities discouraged people from sleeping in stations. Officials worried about overcrowding and disruption to transport services. However, the public quickly made its own decisions. Thousands of Londoners descended into stations each evening carrying blankets, pillows, and food. Platforms that normally served commuters became temporary communities. Children slept on improvised beds. Families played cards to pass the time. Some people read books or newspapers while waiting for the raids to end. Volunteers organized tea and refreshments. Doctors and nurses were often available if needed. Photographs from the period show long rows of people sleeping side by side beneath electric lights while trains continued operating on nearby tracks. Despite the circumstances, many people remembered a strong sense of community. Neighbors who had rarely spoken before the war became close friends. People shared food, newspapers, and information. Birthdays were celebrated underground. Musicians occasionally performed for shelter occupants. Humor remained an important part of daily life. Jokes and cartoons about air raids appeared regularly in newspapers and magazines. Meanwhile, above ground, emergency services worked throughout the night. Firefighters faced some of the most difficult conditions of the war. Incendiary bombs were designed specifically to start fires rather than destroy buildings through explosive force. Large numbers could overwhelm local fire brigades very quickly. Crews often worked for hours without rest. Water pressure sometimes became a problem when mains were damaged. Additional fire engines were brought from surrounding areas whenever possible. Auxiliary fire service volunteers joined professional firefighters in enormous numbers. Many had little previous experience but quickly learned under difficult circumstances. Air raid precautions wardens also became central figures during raids. They directed civilians toward shelters, checked damaged buildings and assisted rescue teams. Many worked long hours despite the dangers. Some became well-known figures within their neighborhoods. The image of the ARP warden carrying a helmet and flashlight became one of the recognizable symbols of wartime Britain. Rescue teams faced particularly difficult tasks after large raids. Collapsed buildings often trapped occupants beneath rubble. Specialist crews searched damaged structures for survivors. This work could continue for many hours or even days after an attack. Dogs were sometimes used to locate people trapped beneath debris. Medical services adapted rapidly to wartime conditions. Hospitals prepared for mass casualties long before the Blitz began. Additional beds were installed. Medical supplies were stockpiled. Emergency procedures were developed and refined. The experience gained during these years would influence emergency medicine long after the war had ended. London was not the only city to experience bombing. Many industrial centres became targets. Liverpool suffered heavily because of its importance as a port. Coventry experienced one of the most destructive raids of the war during November 1940. Birmingham, Bristol, Plymouth, Southampton, Portsmouth, Manchester and Sheffield all endured repeated attacks. The pattern often reflected military and industrial priorities. Shipyards, factories, railway facilities and ports were frequent targets. The Coventry raid became particularly famous. During the night of the 14th of November, 1940, hundreds of bombers attacked the city. Large parts of the city centre were destroyed or heavily damaged. Coventry Cathedral suffered devastating damage and became one of the enduring images of the war in Britain. By the morning, much of the city centre had been transformed. The destruction shocked many people across the country. Yet production often resumed remarkably quickly. Factories repaired damage and returned to work. Railway lines reopened. Essential services continued wherever possible. Maintaining production became a national priority. The government understood that aircraft, ships and vehicles could only be produced if factories remained operational. For this reason, industrial workers became just as important to the war effort as soldiers and sailors. Many factories introduced 24-hour production schedules. Workers rotated through day and night shifts. Long hours became common. Women entered factories in increasing numbers and performed a huge range of tasks. By the middle years of the war, women could be found assembling aircraft engines, manufacturing ammunition, operating machinery, and inspecting finished equipment. Their contribution became one of the defining features of Britain's wartime economy. Despite the bombing, ordinary life continued wherever possible. Schools often reopened quickly after raids. Shops resumed business. Public transport returned to service. Children still attended lessons. Football matches and cricket games continued when circumstances allowed. Cinemas remained popular throughout the war. For many people, films provided a temporary escape from anxiety and uncertainty. Newsreels shown before the main feature became important sources of information. The cinema audience often learned about military events through moving pictures before they read about them in newspapers the following day. Radio remained equally important. The BBC provided news bulletins, music and entertainment programs that reached homes across the country. Families frequently gathered around wireless sets during the evening. Popular comedy programs attracted large audiences. Music broadcasts offered comfort and familiarity during difficult periods. The voice of the announcer became a reassuring part of everyday life. Christmas of 1940 arrived during one of the hardest winters of the war. Many families celebrated in damaged homes or temporary accommodation. Some fathers and sons remained overseas with the armed forces. Others worked night shifts in factories or emergency services. Presents were often modest because of shortages and rationing. Nevertheless, many people later remembered those wartime Christmas celebrations with surprising warmth. Communities organized events for children. Church services remained well attended. People made decorations from whatever materials they could find. The determination to preserve ordinary traditions became an important source of morale. By the spring of 1941, the intensity of the Blitz gradually began to decrease. The danger had not disappeared, but the worst months were passing. England had endured months of bombing, disruption, and loss. Factories continued operating. Transport systems continued functioning. The government remained in control. Most importantly, the country had remained in the war. The next phase of the conflict would bring new challenges. Attention would increasingly turn toward food supplies, industrial production, and the long struggle that still lay ahead. Rationing and daily life. By 1941 it had become clear that the war would not end quickly. The dramatic events of 1940 had passed, but they had been replaced by something different and, in many ways, more difficult to describe. The war had become normal. For millions of people across England, daily life settled into routines that would continue for years. Perhaps nothing shaped everyday life more than rationing. Britain depended heavily on imported food before the war. Large quantities of meat, butter, sugar, fruit, and grain arrived by ship from North America, Australia, New Zealand, and other parts of the Empire. German submarines operating in the Atlantic threatened these supply lines continuously. Every ship that failed to reach Britain meant fewer supplies for the population. The government responded by introducing one of the most extensive rationing systems in British history. Every person received a ration book. Inside were coupons that allowed purchases of certain foods and goods. Without the correct coupon, an item could not be purchased regardless of how much money a person possessed. Food rationing was designed to ensure fairness. Rich and poor received largely the same allocations. In some cases, poorer families actually found their diets improving because rationing guaranteed access to foods that had previously been difficult for them to afford. Bacon, butter, and sugar were among the first products to be rationed. Soon meat, cheese, tea, eggs, and many other goods followed. Fresh fruit became scarce. Bananas disappeared almost entirely from British shops for several years. Many children born during the war did not see a banana again until peace returned. Eggs became particularly valuable. Fresh eggs were often difficult to obtain, and many families relied instead on dried egg powder imported from overseas. The powder arrived in large quantities from the United States and was used in cooking and baking throughout the war. Milk was carefully controlled but remained a priority for children and pregnant women. The government regarded nutrition as a matter of national importance. Maintaining the health of the population was essential for both factory production and military service. The Ministry of Food launched information campaigns encouraging healthy eating and efficient use of ingredients. Recipes were published in newspapers and magazines. Radio programs offered cooking advice. People learned to prepare meals using whatever ingredients were available. Vegetables became increasingly important. Potatoes appeared in meals almost every day. Carrots became particularly associated with wartime Britain. Government campaigns encouraged their use in soups, cakes, puddings, and jams. Some of these recipes became famous for reasons that had little to do with taste. One of the most famous wartime inventions was the Woolton pie. Named after the Minister of Food, Lord Woolton, the dish consisted largely of vegetables baked beneath pastry. It was nutritious, inexpensive, and made from ingredients that remained relatively easy to obtain. Opinions regarding its flavor varied considerably. Clothing also became subject to rationing. New clothes required coupons as well as money. As a result, people repaired garments repeatedly rather than replacing them. Coats were altered and reused. Children's clothing was handed down between brothers and sisters. Patches became common sights on elbows and knees. The government promoted campaigns encouraging people to make do and mend. Booklets and advertisements explained how old clothing could be repaired or transformed into something new. Curtains became dresses. Old jackets became children's coats. Nothing was wasted if it could be used again. Fuel shortages affected many households as well. Coal remained the main source of heating for much of the country. Supplies had to be carefully managed, particularly during winter. Many families heated only 1 or 2 rooms during cold weather. Doors remained closed to keep warmth inside. Hot water bottles became valuable household items. People often wore extra layers indoors rather than increasing heating. The winters of the early 1940s were remembered as particularly cold by many who experienced them. Transport changed considerably during the war years. Petrol rationing dramatically reduced civilian driving. Private cars often disappeared from the roads entirely. Some vehicles were converted to use alternative fuels. Buses, bicycles, and trains became even more important than before. Railways carried enormous numbers of passengers and huge quantities of freight. Coal, food, military equipment, and troops all depended upon the railway network. Stations operated day and night. Steam locomotives became one of the essential engines of the British war effort. The postal system remained equally important. Millions of letters traveled between families and servicemen stationed around the world. Mail arrived from North Africa, India, the Atlantic Ocean, and eventually from Europe itself. For many families, the arrival of a letter became the most important moment of the day. Some letters were read repeatedly until the paper itself began to wear thin. Schools continued operating throughout the war despite numerous difficulties. Children carried gas masks to school each day. Air raid drills formed part of normal education. Lessons occasionally stopped during alerts. In some areas, classes moved temporarily into shelters or alternative buildings following bombing raids. Teachers were expected not only to educate but also to provide stability during uncertain times. Many succeeded remarkably well. For evacuated children living in the countryside, the experience varied enormously. Some enjoyed their new surroundings and developed lifelong affection for rural life. Others missed home intensely and counted the days until they could return. The differences between urban and rural Britain sometimes caused misunderstandings. Children from industrial cities often encountered farm animals and agricultural life for the first time. Country families occasionally struggled to understand the experiences of children who had grown up in crowded urban neighborhoods. Nevertheless, many strong friendships developed. Women played an increasingly important role in every part of national life. By 1941, large numbers were working in industries that had previously employed mostly men. Factories producing aircraft, vehicles, ammunition, and radio equipment relied heavily on female labor. Others joined auxiliary military organizations. Women served as drivers, clerks, radar operators, mechanics, and communication specialists. The image of wartime Britain as a society in which everyone contributed in some way became an important part of public morale. Agriculture experienced enormous change as well. Before the war, Britain imported much of its food. Now domestic production became essential. The Dig for Victory campaign encouraged citizens to grow food wherever possible. Parks, gardens, and unused fields were converted into farmland. Vegetable patches appeared in surprising locations. Even parts of famous public spaces were used for cultivation. Farmers worked long hours to increase production. Tractors gradually replaced horses on many farms, although both continued to be used throughout the war. The Women's Land Army provided additional labor where needed. Young women from towns and cities traveled to farms to help with planting, harvesting, and animal care. For some, it was their first experience of rural life. Their work became an important part of maintaining Britain's food supply. Despite shortages and restrictions, people continued to seek entertainment and normality. Football continued throughout much of the war, although competitions were reorganized to reduce travel. Cricket returned whenever circumstances allowed. Dance halls remained popular. Music provided an important escape from daily worries. Bands performed in towns and military camps throughout the country. Cinema attendance reached remarkable levels during the war years. For a few hours, audiences could sit in warm theaters and think about something other than ration books, air raid sirens and casualty lists. The newsreels shown before films ensured that the war was never entirely absent, but they also connected local audiences with events taking place thousands of miles away. By the end of 1941, England had become highly organized for a conflict that increasingly stretched across the entire globe. The emergency measures introduced during the early days of the war had become permanent features of daily life. Children had grown older knowing only wartime conditions. Factories had adapted to continuous production. Communities had adapted to shortages. The country had settled into the long rhythm of a war that still showed little sign of ending. Far away from England, however, events were unfolding that would transform the conflict once again and draw even larger parts of the world into the struggle. 1942 and 1943, the Arsenal Island. By 1942, England had been at war for more than 2 years. The sense of emergency that had characterized 1940 had gradually evolved into something different. The country had become highly organized, highly disciplined and remarkably efficient in directing its resources toward the war effort. Factories that had once produced civilian goods now produced military equipment almost exclusively. Car factories manufactured aircraft engines and armored vehicles. Engineering companies produced artillery and machine tools. Shipyards launched destroyers, escorts, and merchant vessels at an extraordinary pace. Entire industries had been reorganized for war. Aircraft production remained one of the country's highest priorities. By this stage of the conflict, British factories were producing thousands of aircraft every year. Fighter aircraft such as the Spitfire continued to roll off assembly lines in large numbers. Bomber production expanded rapidly as well. The crews who flew these aircraft often trained for months before joining operational squadrons. Many airfields across England became small communities in their own right. Pilots, navigators, radio operators, armorers, mechanics, cooks and drivers all lived and worked together on bases that operated around the clock. A typical bomber station rarely slept. Aircraft returned during the early hours of the morning. Ground crews inspected damage and prepared machines for future missions. Fuel bowsers moved continuously between dispersal areas. Engines were tested. Reports were written. Briefings were prepared. By the time one operation ended, preparations for the next had already begun. For civilians living near airfields, the sound of aircraft engines became a normal part of everyday life. Children often became experts at identifying different aircraft types simply by listening to the sound overhead. Some could distinguish fighters from bombers without ever looking up. Others learned to identify individual engines by ear. Many people later remembered the distant sound of aircraft passing overhead during the night as one of the defining sounds of wartime England. Industrial production required enormous numbers of workers. By the middle years of the war, women formed a large part of the workforce in many sectors. Factories that had employed mostly men before 1939 now relied heavily on female labor. Women assembled aircraft wings, produced ammunition, operated lathes and milling machines, inspected precision instruments and maintained production records. Many worked shifts that included nights and weekends. Long hours became common throughout wartime industry. The work could be repetitive and physically demanding. Nevertheless, production targets continued to rise. Factory notice boards often displayed weekly totals and records. Workers took considerable pride in the number of aircraft, engines, or vehicles that left their factory each month. Coal production remained equally important. Britain depended heavily upon coal for electricity generation, transport, and industrial production. Coal-powered locomotives, heated homes, and supplied countless factories. Mining communities therefore occupied a crucial position within the wartime economy. The work was dangerous and physically exhausting. Miners often spent long shifts underground under difficult conditions. Despite this, production had to continue. Without coal, much of the British economy would have struggled to function. The railways experienced similar pressures. During peacetime, the railway network had been busy. During wartime, it became essential. Troops traveled by train. Equipment traveled by train. Food traveled by train. Coal traveled by train. Ports, factories, and military bases depended upon reliable transport. Railway workers maintained tracks damaged by weather and heavy use. Signalmen worked long hours. Maintenance crews repaired locomotives that had traveled almost continuously for months. Steam engines became some of the hardest working machines in the country. The ports of England also played a vital role. Liverpool, Bristol, Southampton, Hull, and numerous smaller ports handled enormous quantities of cargo. Food from Canada and Australia arrived alongside oil, timber, and raw materials. Convoys crossed the Atlantic despite the constant threat posed by German submarines. Losses remained serious throughout much of the war. Each successful convoy therefore represented an important victory. Dock workers unloaded ships regardless of weather conditions. Cargoes had to move quickly if factories and cities were to remain supplied. By late 1942, another change became increasingly visible throughout southern England. American servicemen began arriving in growing numbers. The United States had entered the war following the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, and Britain quickly became one of the main bases for American operations in Europe. At first, the numbers were relatively small. Soon they became impossible to miss. American uniforms appeared in railway stations, town centers, and village streets. Airfields expanded to accommodate new aircraft and personnel. Temporary camps appeared across the countryside. Road traffic increased noticeably in some regions. Many English people encountered Americans for the first time during these years. Differences in accent, food, and customs often became topics of conversation. American chewing gum attracted considerable attention among British children. Chocolate and cigarettes were frequently traded or given away. Some local residents were impressed by the apparent abundance of American equipment and supplies. Others were amused by differences in vocabulary and pronunciation. The arrival of large numbers of foreign servicemen inevitably brought occasional tensions, but it also created many friendships and marriages. Some of these families eventually settled in Britain after the war. Others emigrated to the United States in the years that followed. Throughout 1943, preparations for future operations accelerated. Large areas of southern England increasingly resembled enormous military camps. New airfields were constructed. Roads were improved. Storage depots appeared in fields and forests. Military vehicles became increasingly common on country roads. The countryside itself began to change. Some fields were converted into airstrips. Others became training grounds. Temporary buildings appeared where livestock had once grazed. Local populations gradually became accustomed to seeing convoys moving through villages during the early morning hours. Training intensified across all branches of the armed forces. Soldiers practiced landings on beaches that resembled those found across the English Channel. Engineers constructed bridges and obstacles for training purposes. Exercises involving thousands of men became increasingly common. Secrecy surrounded much of this activity. Rumors circulated widely, but relatively few people knew exactly what was being planned. Meanwhile, ordinary civilian life continued under familiar wartime restrictions. Ration books remained essential. Queues outside shops remained common. Clothing coupons were still carefully guarded. Children still carried gas masks to school, although many had long since stopped expecting poison gas attacks to occur. The blackout remained in place. By now, many younger children had spent almost half their lives under wartime conditions. For them, these restrictions simply represented normal life. Some had no memory at all of brightly lit streets after sunset. Others had never experienced unrestricted food supplies. A generation was growing up in circumstances their parents could never have imagined before 1939. The war had become a permanent feature of life. Yet by late 1943, there were signs that the balance of the conflict might finally be changing. Newspaper reports increasingly carried stories of Allied advances overseas. Military production continued to rise. American forces continued to arrive. Across southern England, equipment and supplies accumulated in enormous quantities. Harbors filled with landing craft. Airfields filled with aircraft. The roads filled with military traffic. Something large was being prepared. Although very few people knew the details, many suspected that England would soon play a central role in the return to continental Europe. The next great chapter of the war was approaching. 1944, preparing for the return to Europe. By the beginning of 1944, England had become the center of the largest military concentration in its history. For years, soldiers, equipment, and supplies had flowed steadily into the country. Now the scale of these preparations became visible almost everywhere, particularly in southern England. Entire regions began to change. Fields that had once grown wheat or supported grazing animals became vehicle parks and supply depots. Woodlands concealed fuel stores and ammunition dumps. Temporary roads appeared where no roads had existed before. Military camps stretched across the countryside. For local residents, the sight of military vehicles became entirely ordinary. Convoys of trucks moved along narrow country roads. Columns of soldiers marched between camps and railway stations. Road signs occasionally disappeared or were covered for security reasons. Military police became familiar figures in towns and villages. Many areas experienced restrictions on movement as preparations intensified. The number of American servicemen increased dramatically during the first half of 1944. By the spring, well over 1 million American military personnel were stationed in Britain. Many villages suddenly found themselves transformed. Public halls hosted dances. Church groups organized social events. Local football teams occasionally played matches against military teams. Shopkeepers adapted to new customers with unfamiliar accents and different habits. Children often gathered near military camps in the hope of receiving chewing gum or chocolate. For many young people, these encounters became some of their strongest memories of the war. The railways entered one of the busiest periods in their history. Military trains operated day and night. Troops moved from camps to ports and training areas. Supplies moved continuously between factories, warehouses, and embarkation points. Civilian travel became increasingly difficult as military transport received priority. Stations that had once handled mainly commuters and holidaymakers now processed enormous volumes of military traffic. Porters worked long shifts. Signalmen faced intense pressure. Locomotives accumulated extraordinary mileage. The railway system became one of the hidden foundations of the coming operation. Ports along the south coast underwent major changes as well. Large numbers of landing craft arrived from shipyards around Britain and North America. Harbors became crowded with vessels of every size. Warehouses filled with fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts. Dock workers handled cargoes around the clock. Security measures became increasingly strict. Rumors spread easily, but official information remained limited. Even many of those directly involved knew only small parts of the overall plan. The operation itself would eventually receive the name Operation Overlord. Its objective was simple to describe and enormously difficult to achieve. The Allies intended to cross the English Channel, establish a foothold in France and begin the liberation of Western Europe. Training occupied much of the spring of 1944. Soldiers practiced boarding landing craft repeatedly. Engineers rehearsed bridge construction. Medical units prepared casualty stations. Drivers learned routes and procedures. Pilots studied maps and photographs. Naval crews trained for coastal operations. Every part of the operation required detailed planning. The amount of paperwork alone was enormous. Maps, orders, and schedules filled offices throughout southern England. Meteorologists became increasingly important as well. Weather conditions would play a major role in determining when the invasion could begin. Wind, cloud cover, and sea conditions all mattered. A successful crossing required a combination of factors that could not be guaranteed. As the planned date approached, secrecy became even more important. Many troops were confined to their camps to prevent information from spreading. Letters home were restricted. Leave was cancelled. Telephone calls became limited. The number of people who understood the full scale of what was coming remained very small. For civilians living nearby, however, the signs were impossible to miss. Roads filled with military vehicles. Aircraft crowded airfields. The countryside seemed full of uniforms. Many people understood that an important operation was approaching even if they did not know exactly where or when it would occur. Then came June. Bad weather delayed the operation briefly. Commanders faced difficult decisions. Conditions over the Channel remained uncertain. Finally, a narrow opportunity appeared. The invasion would proceed. During the night of the 5th and the early morning hours of the 6th of June, 1944, enormous numbers of aircraft crossed the Channel. Paratroopers landed in France. Soon afterwards, ships began moving toward the Normandy coast. From southern England, some civilians reported hearing the distant sound of aircraft engines continuing for hours. Others watched long streams of vessels disappearing toward the horizon. The scale of the movement was unlike anything seen before. Thousands of ships participated. Thousands of aircraft participated. Hundreds of thousands of men would eventually cross the Channel. The events of D-Day unfolded in France, but England remained central to the operation. Reinforcements departed continuously. Supplies followed behind the troops. Hospitals prepared to receive casualties. Airfields remained active around the clock. Ports worked without interruption. The invasion was not a single day but the beginning of a vast logistical effort that would continue for many months. As news of the landing spread, many people experienced cautious optimism. The war was clearly not over. Heavy fighting still lay ahead. Casualty lists continued to appear. Families continued waiting for letters and telegrams. Yet for the first time in many years, there was a growing sense that the conflict might eventually end in victory. Throughout the summer and autumn of 1944, England continued to support operations on the continent. Factories maintained production. Railways maintained transport. Farms maintained food production. The enormous machinery of wartime Britain continued operating at full capacity. The blackout still existed. Ration books were still necessary. Children still attended school carrying memories of air raid sirens and shelters. But the atmosphere had begun to change. People spoke more often about what life might look like after the war. Questions that had once seemed distant suddenly became relevant. When would soldiers come home? When would restrictions end? When would lights return to the streets at night? For the first time in many years, such questions no longer felt unrealistic. The end of the war was not yet visible, but it no longer felt impossible to imagine. The final year of war. Although the Allied armies had returned to continental Europe in 1944, the war was not yet over for the people of England. During the summer of that year, a new threat appeared in the skies above southern England. Unlike the bombers that had crossed the Channel during the Blitz, these new weapons arrived without pilots. They were known as WWII flying bombs. The letter V stood for Vergeltung, meaning retaliation or vengeance. The WWII was essentially an early cruise missile powered by a pulse jet engine. People quickly became familiar with its distinctive sound. Those who lived through the attacks often remember the engine noise more clearly than anything else. The engine produced a rough, repetitive buzzing sound that earned the weapon the nickname buzz bomb or doodlebug. As long as the engine continued running, people knew the weapon was still flying somewhere overhead. The moment the engine stopped was often the moment people feared most. Silence usually meant that the bomb was descending. The first WWII attacks began in June 1944. London became the primary target, although many bombs fell elsewhere across southern England. Some failed shortly after launch. Others were destroyed by anti-aircraft guns or intercepted by fighter aircraft. Many, however, reached populated areas. The British response combined several different methods. Anti-aircraft batteries were repositioned to improve coverage. Radar systems tracked incoming weapons. Fighter pilots developed techniques for shooting down the flying bombs or even disrupting them by flying close enough to disturb their guidance systems. The campaign gradually became more successful as experience increased. Yet for civilians, the attacks introduced a new kind of uncertainty. Traditional air raids often involved sirens and warnings. The WWII frequently arrived with little notice. The sound overhead became a familiar part of life during the summer and autumn of 1944. Not long afterwards, another weapon appeared. This time there was no warning sound at all. The WWII rocket became the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. Traveling faster than the speed of sound, it arrived before anyone could hear it approaching. The first indication of an attack was often the explosion itself. For those on the ground, the experience felt entirely different from previous bombing campaigns. There were no approaching aircraft. No engines overhead. No time to seek shelter. The rocket simply arrived. The technology behind the weapon represented a remarkable engineering achievement, but for civilians living under attack it was simply another reminder that the war was not yet over. Despite these attacks, the general direction of the conflict had become increasingly clear by late 1944. Reports from the continent described Allied advances through France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Newspaper maps that had once shown retreat now showed steady progress eastward. The radio brought regular updates from Europe. Families followed developments closely, particularly if relatives were serving overseas. The postal system continued to play an important role. Letters remained one of the most important links between military personnel and home. Some letters traveled enormous distances before reaching their destinations. Many were folded and unfolded dozens of times before eventually being stored away. For families waiting at home, a letter could bring reassurance during difficult weeks. A short message confirming good health often meant more than several pages of description. At the same time, telegram deliveries remained moments that many families feared. The sight of an official messenger approaching the house could bring immediate anxiety. Communities throughout England experienced losses during the war years. Memorial services became familiar events in churches and town halls. Names were added to local memorials alongside those from the previous war. By the beginning of 1945, the conflict in Europe was entering its final phase. Factories continued operating at high levels of production, but conversations increasingly turned toward the future. people wondered how quickly rationing would end. They wondered whether wartime jobs would disappear. Parents wondered what kind of country their children would inherit after peace returned. Many servicemen had spent years away from home. Some children had little memory of life before the war. For younger members of the population, blackout curtains, ration books, and gas masks had always existed. They had never known anything else. As spring approached in 1945, military developments moved quickly. German forces retreated on multiple fronts. Cities that had been occupied for years were liberated. The sense that the war might finally be ending spread gradually through the country. Then, in early May, the news arrived. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The date was the 8th of May, 1945. It became known as Victory in Europe Day, or simply VE Day. Across England, celebrations began almost immediately. Church bells rang out once again. For many communities, this was the first time they had been rung freely since the early days of the war. Crowds gathered in city centers and village squares. Flags appeared in windows. Tables were carried into streets for celebrations and parties. Neighbors who had spent years sharing shelters, shortages, and uncertainty gathered together to mark the occasion. In London, enormous crowds filled central streets. Photographs from the day show smiling faces packed tightly together beneath flags and banners. Elsewhere, smaller celebrations took place in towns and villages across the country. Children who had grown up during wartime suddenly found themselves part of events they would remember for the rest of their lives. Yet even amid celebration, the mood was often more complex than later memories sometimes suggest. Many families still had relatives serving overseas. The war against Japan continued. Others thought about friends and family members who would never return. Relief, gratitude, and sadness often existed together. For many people, the overwhelming feeling was not excitement but exhaustion. Nearly 6 years had passed since September 1939. An entire chapter of life had come to an end. The following weeks brought gradual changes rather than sudden transformation. The blackout ended. Street lights returned. Windows no longer needed heavy curtains after sunset. For some younger children, brightly lit streets after dark seemed almost unusual. Rationing, however, did not disappear immediately. Many restrictions remained in place for years after the fighting ended. Britain had exhausted enormous resources during the war, and rebuilding would take time. Factories shifted back towards civilian production. Military camps slowly emptied. Servicemen returned home in stages over many months. Railway stations once again became places of reunion. Children met fathers they had not seen for years. Communities adjusted slowly to peacetime life. The England that emerged from the war was not the same England that had entered it in 1939. Cities had changed. Industries had changed. Families had changed. The role of women in society had changed. The relationship between government and ordinary citizens had changed. The country that entered the post-war years carried the experiences of 6 difficult years into everything that followed. And yet many parts of ordinary life returned remarkably quickly. Milk continued to arrive in the mornings. Trains continued to leave stations according to their timetables. Children returned to schools without carrying gas masks. Football crowds returned to stadiums. Gardens were planted once more for pleasure rather than necessity. The sounds of construction slowly replaced the sounds of war. For those who had lived through the period, memories often centered not only on the great events recorded in history books, but on smaller details. The weight of a ration book in a coat pocket. The smell of damp air inside a shelter. The sound of aircraft passing overhead during the night. The sight of blackout curtains being opened at dawn. The arrival of a long-awaited letter. The first evening when streetlights shone once again. These were the moments that remained. These were the memories carried forward into peacetime. And for England, the long years of war had finally come to an end. Epilogue: the small details of wartime England. When people remembered wartime England many years later, they often remembered the great events first. They remembered Dunkirk. They remembered the Battle of Britain. They remembered the Blitz and the celebrations on VE Day. But after a little time had passed, many memories became smaller and quieter. People remembered ordinary mornings. They remembered routines. They remembered details that would have seemed completely unimportant at the time. For millions of families, the day often began with the sound of the milkman making his rounds. Glass bottles stood waiting outside front doors in the early morning air. Some deliveries took place before sunrise during winter months. In colder weather, cream sometimes froze near the top of the bottle and pushed the foil cap upward slightly. Bread deliveries were common as well. Many households still bought fresh bread frequently rather than storing large quantities at home. Coal deliveries remained an important part of life throughout much of the country. Coal was carried into houses, cellars, and sheds where it would later feed fireplaces and kitchen ranges. A large coal delivery before winter often brought a sense of reassurance. Many homes relied entirely upon coal for both heating and cooking. During the coldest months, a great deal of family life centered around whichever room contained the fire. People read beside it. Children completed homework beside it. Clothes dried beside it. Family conversations often took place beside it. Bedrooms frequently remained much colder than modern homes. On winter mornings it was not unusual for frost to appear on the inside of windows. Getting out of bed could require considerable determination. Many people dressed quickly and looked forward to reaching the warmer rooms downstairs. Hot water was not always available throughout the house. In many homes, water for washing was heated separately. Baths often took place only once or twice each week. Family members frequently used the same bath water one after another, with the youngest children often going first. Laundry required enormous amounts of time and effort. Washing machines existed, but they were far from universal. Clothing was washed, dried, and ironed by hand in many households. Monday was traditionally washing day in countless homes across England. Large quantities of washing hanging outside on lines became a familiar sight whenever the weather allowed. The weather itself played an important role in everyday planning. Rain influenced almost everything. Children walked to school in rain. Workers cycled to factories in rain. Farmers worked in rain. Railway workers maintained tracks in rain. The British reputation for discussing the weather was already well established long before the war began, and wartime conditions did nothing to reduce that habit. Conversations about fog, frost, and rainfall filled homes, buses, and workplaces. Tea remained one of the constants of British life. Even during shortages, tea retained enormous importance. Factory breaks often revolved around tea. Meetings involved tea. Visitors were offered tea. Bad news was discussed over tea. Good news was celebrated with tea. Many people later joked that the country had run on tea almost as much as it had run on coal. A typical breakfast varied according to ration availability. Bread remained common. Porridge was popular, particularly during colder months. Jam was used whenever it could be obtained. Eggs were highly valued when available. Some families kept chickens specifically to improve their food supply. Lunch often depended upon work schedules. Factory workers frequently carried packed meals. School children sometimes brought sandwiches. The main meal generally took place during the evening. Potatoes appeared regularly. Seasonal vegetables appeared frequently. Meat was carefully portioned and rarely wasted. Leftovers became ingredients for future meals. Waste of any kind was strongly discouraged. Children attended school under conditions that would seem unusual today. Many walked considerable distances. School dinners became increasingly important as rationing continued. Classrooms were heated unevenly during winter. Ink pens remained common. Exercise books were carefully used because paper supplies were limited. Air raid drills became routine. Children practiced lining up quickly and moving toward shelters in an orderly manner. For younger children, these drills eventually became as ordinary as fire drills are today. The school day itself remained an important source of stability. Lessons continued. Homework continued. Examinations continued. The government considered education too important to abandon even during wartime. Entertainment often involved activities that required little money. Board games remained popular. Card games were common. Families listened to the wireless together during the evening. The BBC provided news, drama, comedy, and music. Programs such as comedy shows and variety performances became enormously popular. The familiar voices of broadcasters entered millions of homes each day. For some elderly listeners, radio personalities eventually became almost like distant relatives who visited every evening. Cinema attendance reached remarkable levels during the war years. Many cinemas held several screenings each day. The cinema offered warmth, light, and temporary escape. Newsreels informed audiences about military developments. Feature films provided entertainment. For a few hours, rationing and air raid sirens could be forgotten. Cycling remained one of the most important forms of transport. Bicycles carried workers to factories, children to schools, and shoppers to local stores. Tires became difficult to replace during wartime. Repairs therefore became common. A well-maintained bicycle was a valuable possession. Rail travel remained central to British life. Steam locomotives hauled passenger coaches and freight wagons across the country in enormous numbers. Railway stations remained places of movement, farewells, and reunions throughout the war. Many people remembered the smell of steam, coal smoke, and engine oil long after the conflict had ended. Postmen continued their rounds in almost every circumstance. Letters connected families separated by oceans and continents. A letter arriving from overseas could transform an ordinary day. Some people recognized the handwriting on an envelope immediately and knew who had written before opening it. Others kept letters tied together with string for decades afterwards. Clothing often lasted much longer than modern clothing. Shoes were repaired repeatedly. Jackets were altered. Socks were darned rather than replaced. Children became accustomed to hand-me-down clothing from older brothers, sisters, and cousins. New clothes carried a significance that is sometimes difficult to imagine today. Receiving a new coat or pair of shoes could become one of the memorable moments of an entire year. Gardens changed during wartime as well. Flower beds gave way to vegetables in many places. Lawns became potato patches. Fruit trees became valuable resources. Garden sheds stored tools, fuel, and occasionally air raid equipment. For many families, gardening became both a practical necessity and a welcome distraction from worrying news. Churches remained important centers of community life. Services continued throughout the war. Church halls hosted meetings, collections, and social events. Many communities gathered there during moments of celebration and moments of grief. The sound of church bells eventually became one of the sounds of peace returning in 1945. Perhaps the most remarkable feature of wartime England was not any single event but the quiet persistence of ordinary routines. Children still grew taller. Birthdays still arrived each year. People still fell in love. Gardens still needed tending. Shoes still needed polishing. Laundry still needed washing. The routines of ordinary life continued beside extraordinary events. For 6 long years, millions of people woke each morning and simply continued with the work that needed to be done. Factories opened. Schools opened. Trains departed. Letters arrived. Meals were prepared. And little by little, day by day, month by month, those ordinary routines carried the country from the uncertain days of 1939 to the celebrations of 1945. History often remembers wars through battles and leaders. Those things matter. But the history of wartime England was also written in kitchens, classrooms, gardens, railway stations, and factory floors. It was written in ration books and train tickets. It was written in letters sent across oceans. It was written in the quiet determination of ordinary people living ordinary lives during extraordinary times. And perhaps that is the detail most worth remembering of all.